This presentation will explore how to incorporate explicit vocabulary instruction into social studies lessons. In a past presentation, I talked about the importance of integrating vocabulary into the anticipatory set of a lesson. And that's the first step, the explicit introduction of vocabulary, which we'll touch upon some specifics on how you can do that in this session. Then we'll look at how to take it to the next step. Once you've introduced the words the first time, how to follow up with some meaningful vocabulary experiences. First, a little background on vocabulary. It is important to note that in content-related lessons, students need to be familiar with at least 90% of the words that they encounter, whether it be the words in the reading passages or the words that you're going to use in your presentation. Now, they don't necessarily need to be experts in these words and truly master all 90% of this base of information, but they need to have had some experience with at least 90% of the words. They should not be brand new words that they have never heard before. Let's jump to a literacy perspective. This also applies to guided reading and independent reading, that in independent reading books, students need to be able to recognize 95% of the words, meaning they can actually fluently say 95% of the words. From a guided reading perspective, when you're working whole class, it needs to be 90%, just like sort of similar percentages to the content exposure to words. But in a social studies lesson, keep in mind 90% of the words they experience, they should have seen before. Now, when you're in an anticipatory of a lesson and you're introducing new vocabulary words, as I've said, you don't want to overload too many words in each lesson at this juncture. And there's one reason, because there are a prescribed set of steps in an anticipatory that you should do when introducing new vocabulary. These are the 5 steps that you should do for each word. 2 of the steps are teacher-led, and then 3 of the steps are student-led. So the first thing that when you're introducing a new word in an anticipatory, the first thing the teacher does is explain that word. So the teacher is going to give a paraphrased definition, some examples. They're going to put that word into context. Then the teacher is going to provide a non-linguistic representation. So not just giving them an explanation of the word and a definition, but they're going to either show a picture or a movement or something non-linguistic that also ties in as a form of a mnemonic. Then you turn it to the students for the next 3 steps. Then you turn it to the students. They're going to paraphrase what they just heard. So they're going to put the explanation of the word into their own words. They're then going to create their own non-linguistic representation of the word, and then they're going to share the word. So these are the 5 steps, and it may seem like, wow, these are a lot of steps. But once this process becomes routine for the students, it will be fairly automatic, and you could be somewhat expedient with it. But the idea is when you're introducing new words in an anticipatory, and it's the first time they've come across them, you want to spend time with the words so that they will better understand them as you continue to integrate these words into future lessons in the unit or the learning segment. So these are the 5 steps. To teacher, explain using linguistics, then a non-linguistic representation, and then the students do the same thing and they share. For example, let's look at the word cultural diffusion. So the teacher might first have a discussion using linguistic perspectives on what cultural diffusion means. They may provide an idea that it's the spreading of customs from one culture to another. Now keep in mind, if that's the explanation I'm using, my students had already better be familiar with the word custom and the word culture. If they were not familiar with those 2 words, I would have to use different terminology. Do not use terminology to explain a word that the students don't already know. You want to use words in the explanation that they understand. So I'm assuming in this instance that we've already explored the words customs and culture. Now, let's look at non-linguistic representation. The classic non-linguistic representation would be a picture. So you can see here's an image that sort of shows cultural diffusion and how McDonald's, an American cultural icon, has diffused throughout the world. That's an example of a non-linguistic representation. Non-linguistic representations, however, can be more than just pictures. A lot of times a movement could be an effective non-linguistic representation. So after I, the teacher, have given the linguistic representation, that definition and explanation, perhaps instead of a picture, I'd want to use a movement. With cultural diffusion, I always use the non-linguistic representation, cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion. We see two cultures, and when they come together, elements from each culture are being shared and passed so that we see elements of them represented in our daily lives. That's an example of a movement-based non-linguistic representation. I would recommend using a balance of both, especially once you know the learning styles of your students. Visual spatial people will appreciate the visual non-linguistic representations. Kinesthetic learners will appreciate the movement ones. And when your students are when you're getting into step 3, 4, and 5, when they create their own explanation and their own non-linguistics, allow them to cater to their own learning styles as well. A few things to consider with this anticipatory method of introducing new vocabulary, this 5-step process, that despite your best efforts, there may be some misconceptions that do arise even with this. This is not a foolproof way of magically gaining understanding of vocabulary words, but this will reduce misconceptions. This is the idea that you're not just done with these words once this 5-step process has occurred. You will keep using these words and you will follow up with these words in other parts of other lessons throughout the unit. So that by coming back to these words, if there are some misconceptions that do occur, you can remediate those and you can address them. But this will help to reduce misconceptions. Another thing, it will be hard to check the students' work in step 3, 4, or 5, but circulate and try to look as many as you can. And if you can't look at it at that juncture, keep in mind that if they're writing it in some sort of organizational packet, you can then check it at a later date. Don't underemphasize the importance of the collaborative pairing. That when students are in steps 3, 4, and 5, when they're creating their own explanation and their own non-linguistic representation, you can have them do it collaboratively. It does not have to be alone. So you can have them pair up or group up for steps 3, 4, and 5. And that ties in with the gallery walk, the idea that have students share their work with one another, because it will allow them to see different perspectives and they might borrow ideas from one another to really have better understandings of the vocabulary word. Another thing to consider are students with limited language skills. So a couple of ways to address this. One, you can have students with strong language skills pair with students with limited language skills. Keep in mind that the strong students, the strong language skilled students also need to be well endowed with interpersonal intelligence. There's a certain type of student that works well in a situation like that, but you can heterogeneously pair up your language skilled children. The other thing is the notion of accelerated practice, that students with limited language skills, give them the words ahead of time before even the anticipatory of the lesson. If these students are working with special education teachers or paraprofessionals, you give those teachers the words ahead of time so that they can work with the children prior to the lead up of this lesson. And then when the anticipatory of this lesson, where the words are unrolled to the majority of the class, they will have already had exposure to these words. As I briefly mentioned earlier, you will also want to consider how the students are recording their thoughts with this, the explanation from you or the explanation they create on their own, and the non-linguistic representation. You will definitely want to give them some sort of organizational tool. This is a classic one, the Freyer model. And the Freyer model, you give them this chart for each of the key words. So a lot of times with my students, I had students have a packet of vocabulary words that they would use throughout the learning segment, and it simply was a series of this Freyer model graphic organizer. And for each word, they put it in the center circle. They come up with an explanation, a definition. They can put in characteristics, examples, non-examples. You can customize the 4 boxes to different areas. Usually, one of the boxes could be a non-linguistic representation. If it's done in this manner, either explaining the movement, perhaps if it's a movement-based explanation, or if it's a visual, then have them sketch a non-linguistic explanation of the word. But the Freyer model is a classic organizational tool. If you have the students compile these, and that way you can spot check them later on, whereas you may not have enough time to monitor the students step 3, 4, and 5 during the anticipatory set. If they're putting it into a organizational chart like this, you can check the information later on. That 5-step process is a great anticipatory move when first introducing new content vocabulary. But keep in mind that is not the panacea for truly understanding vocabulary. After you've done that, you will have to come back to these words in other lessons, in other meaningful situations. It isn't just a one-size-fits-all. Here's the words, here are your non-linguistic examples, share, create your own, life is good, you're a master of these words. No. You will come back to these words in meaningful context, and there will be activating strategies that you can use in anticipatory and review. There will be in-context activities with new content and reinforcement where you can use the vocabulary in meaningful ways. And then there are summarizing strategies that you can use, which could be the closure. You won't use vocabulary in all of these situations within one lesson. Keep in mind where you focus on vocabulary will vary from day to day. Some days you may focus on an activating strategy. Other days it may be more appropriate to work with the in-context vocabulary integration. Other times it may be summarizing. So keep in mind these 3 portions will not be covered in every single lesson. If you did, your lesson would be 2 hours long, and you only have 30 or 40 minutes. So pick and choose. Sometimes you'll use in-context activities. Sometimes you'll use summarizing based strategies and bring vocabulary. But the idea is throughout the unit, you are going to offer numerous opportunities to work with these words. In Teams, I have provided a folder that has examples of activating strategies, in-context strategies, and summarizing strategies that you can use with vocabulary, which you'll get a chance to explore at a later date. As always, if you have any questions or would wish to discuss integrating vocabulary into social studies, I'm happy to chat with you about it. Simply reach out and I will be in touch soon. Take care.